This is video 2 on using the Blender add-on called Tissue to do tessellations, running with FluidDesigner for 3D printing. Basically I'm going to show you how you can use curves when you tessellate to create a pendant similar to the one there in the bottom right of the screen. So if you go to Blender and running with FluidDesigner, first of all what we're going to do is go to Add Mesh and Plane. And our default grid is 20 millimeters, so I'm going to set the radius over here to 10 millimeters. That will fill out the grid. Now I need a second plane when I'm tessellating. You always need two objects, so add mesh plane. And I'm going to make this one 1/4 of the size of the large one. So if I do a radius of 2.5 millimeters in the left panel there and enter, that will give me a plane that is 5 millimeters by 5 millimeters. So it's 1/4 of the size of the large plane. Now if I highlight the large plane and press the tab key to go into edit mode, if I do W and subdivide and W and subdivide again, I basically end up with 4x4 panels that are the same size as my small plane on the right, and each of the boxes you can see there is 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter, so each small section of this is 5x5. And so giving us a total of 20 millimeters right across again. Now if I go to the small plane on the right hand side and press the tab key to go into edit mode there, now this time around what I'm going to do is I'm going to subdivide this, but because I'm going to use curves at the end of the day here, the individual meshes in this small plane, I want to keep them larger than the meshes on the large plane. So I'm just going to set the number of cuts that's over in the panel on the left here to 3. So each of the individual mesh cells there on the small plane are slightly larger than they are on the large plane. So that's how I'm going to work in this case. Now before I tessellate it, I do need to delete some of my small plane here. So if I go into face select mode and if I just select a number of faces to delete, and this is the pattern that I'm going to select, if I do X and delete those faces, so that's my basic pattern that I'm going to tessellate onto the large plane. So with the small plane highlighted, hold down the shift key and highlight the large plane. And then in the toolbox on the left, if you click the Create tab and open up the Tissue add-on, we need to tessellate this. And it's very important when you're 3D printing to always tick this merge box, because you don't want to have duplicate vertices. Really important from the point of view of 3D printing, that one. So if we click OK, and it's tessellated it. So if I press the tab key on the keyboard, you can see that that's the pattern that we've got. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this object over here on the right, X, and if I go to the outliner panel, I want to make sure that I delete the right object. I want to delete the original plane here, not the tessellation plane. So what we're left now is just the tessellation plane. Now in video 1 you saw how we could solidify this and create a pendant. Here I'm going to show you a different technique. What we're going to do is, if we hold down the Alt key on the keyboard and press the letter C, we're going to change this into a curve from a mesh. Now this curve is actually a poly curve, and when we're working with curves we need some bevel object, or as I prefer to call it, a cross section. So if I go to Object Library, go to 3D Template Cross Section Bevel Objects, I'm going to use a rectangular cross section here. So I'm going to select this one here and click OK. And if I just scroll back and click outside the yellow box, it places that bevel object right in the middle of the screen. And if I open up the properties panel with N, you can see that the dimensions of this are 1 by 1. So it's essentially square. So if I highlight my tessellation plane, over in the properties panel, if I click on bevel object and select this cross section rectangular bevel object, which is 1 by 1, it will apply that bevel object to my curve, and we end up with that pattern. Now I tend to work with objects that are 2 millimeters deep, so what I really need to do is to select the bevel object in the middle of the screen again, and I want to change either the X or the Y dimension. Now if I change the X dimension to 2 millimeters, that really messes up my finished object, so I'm going to set that back at 1 millimeter, and I'm going to change the Y to 2 millimeters, so that gives me a depth of 2 millimeters. So when I complete this pendant, my outline is going to be 2 millimeters, that's all. But of course you could make this any kind of thickness. Now at the moment, as I say, this is actually the main pendant itself here is actually a poly curve. Now if I go into highlight it and go into edit mode, and if we just select all those control points, and if you hit the space bar and type set spline type, we are in a poly curve at the moment, and if I change it to a Bezier curve, notice that more control points appear, but the basic shape of this doesn't change. But if I hit the space bar again and type set spline type, and if I select NURBS curve, and I often work with NURBS curves, you'll see that we get a much more rounded object. Now I don't think that looks quite as good as for this particular pendant that I'm trying to design. Now you can't go to set spline type and change that back to a Bezier, or at least it messes it up. No conversion possible. So what we need to do is to come out of edit mode with the tab key and do Control Z and return it back to the poly type. And I think I'm actually going to change it to Bezier. So set spline type, and I'm going to leave it as a Bezier curve. So that's just to keep the sharpness in these corners in this instance. Okay. So view and top. Now I want my pendant orientated like that when I create it. So if I just go to view and top view, if I open up the properties panel, if I basically change the Z value to 45 degrees, that will orientate that for me. And now what I want to do is, if I go to Object Library and go to Pendants, I just want to finish this off basically. I'm going to use a square outline for the pendant, so I want to select this object here and click OK, and just click outside the yellow box. And I need to rotate this as well now, so if I do N on the keyboard and change the Z dimension to 45 degrees and close down the property panel. Now notice that the thickness of this is 1 millimeter by 2 millimeters. That's the default cross-sectional value that I normally work to, but as I say, you can change that to whatever you want. But now if I go into edit mode and highlight all of those control points and press S for scale, now I just need to switch off the snap, and we just want it to be touching. Now I don't want anything sticking out this time. I don't want to have to readjust it like I did in the first one. So that seems to be fitting okay. So come out of edit mode, and I do like to do Control A and apply the scale whenever I do that. It's just a bit of a habit of mine, but it is worth doing. So all we need now is a ring at the top, and so if we go to the Object Library, I just need to go to Jewelry Findings, and for pendants I tend to use this 2.5 millimeter internal diameter ring, and just position that at the top, just zoom in on it, and I like to make that the same dimensions as the outline of the pendant. So if I just hold down the Shift key and highlight the outline of the pendant and go to Tools, Object, Tools, Join, that'll take on the same dimensions as that. So that's essentially my pendant created out of curves. If I wanted to personalize it, I could always go to Object Library. I could go to Harrington font, for example, and choose a letter. My system just loads slow, letter A, and just position that. And then if you just open up the properties panel and change the Z position to say 1 millimeter, that'll just raise it up 1 millimeter. So that's what the finished pendant would look like. You just export that as OBJ and run it through NetFab. That's all you need to do.